Yeah, now you should. Yeah, welcome to this last panel of this important conference organized by Maria Grazia, and it is the title of this panel is towards a human rights instrument, but with a question mark. Yeah, so it's important to see that, and we will discuss what are what is positive with a new instrument, what should it be, and or is it enough to spur a better implementation? And if so, we will have to find out, maybe discussing how to do that, because in theory everything is a bit easier, but in practice we know it's difficult. So we speak about 20 years. 20 years we have the Palermo Protocol, and we must admit that already at the beginning, you know, when we had the protocol, I mean, we know it's the most important instrument, international instrument we have, and this is good. So yeah, and it was also when the protocol came out, that new criminal law was developed, changes were made, etc., etc. So, and measures, anti-trafficking measures started to be implemented, but from the beginning on, it was more or less clear that what Mike and others said, you know, that it is not a human rights instrument, yeah, that it was very much logically focused on law enforcement and security issues, because of being the protocol with or linked with the Convention on Organized Crime. And over the years, what we also realize, and what we have to admit, that there are a lot of yeah, let's say, problems here. We see that there is a tendency to brush off certain problems. There is very often a ping pong between institutions and countries. There are still confused perceptions. One wouldn't believe that, you know, especially those who have been working on the issue for such a long time. We would believe that there are confused perceptions between trafficking and related areas, such as illegal migration or illegal immigration, prostitution, smuggling, etc. There are this has already been mentioned before in other panels, that the protocol focuses mainly on sexual exploitation, although there are other ways mentioned there, but there is a lot of space for interpretation, which on the one hand can be positive, but on the other hand, everybody does what everybody interprets in its own way, and the countries use it as they like it. You know, and we saw this a little bit also in the previous panel. Or, for instance, the discussion on slavery and human trafficking. I think this is an important issue. You know? So maybe we can clarify a bit on in this regard, and then discuss whether we do need, or what is positive if we had, or if we would negotiate a new instrument, or is it enough just to implement in a better way. So again, the panelists are the same than in the panel before, plus Maria Grazia. So thank you very much for this. I don't need to introduce you in an intensive way, but let me nevertheless repeat. We have Baca. He is the former US ambassador at large on human trafficking of the US. In the United States, and now he is teaching at Yale Law School. We have Mike Dottridge as independent human rights experts. We have drawn a lot of your experience in all our negotiations and in all our combat. So this is Mike Dottridge as independent human rights expert. We have Boer Buquicchio. She among others. I have known her first already as a former Council of Europe Deputy Secretary General, and she is the architect, really, of the Convention on against human trafficking, and this is already, so to say, a reaction to the Palermo Protocol, because there was the feeling and there was the view that there is not enough focus on human rights and not enough focus on victims. So therefore, the convention was developed. So thank you very much for maybe also being able to address that. And we have Christine Chinking as from the Center for Women, Peace and Security. We'll talk again of the role of the Security Council in this regard, and of course Maria Grazia, the UN Special Rapporteur on human trafficking, especially women and children. So let me ask you to start with, what are the main areas in which national policies and national legislation should be reoriented in a way which is consistent with human rights standards? Is this possible? What do you think? I would just like to ask you one after the other, your view on this, and would start with Rude Baca. Please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Helga. And I think that one of the things that we see, and I'll give a big push for Helga's leadership on this issue, a lot of the structures that I think work are structures that Helga and Steve Warneth and other folks who were involved with the Stability Pact Task Force back in the early 2000s brought into the Balkans, whether it's the interministerial working groups, whether it's national referral mechanisms, a lot of things that we now think of as just kind of normal anti-trafficking. And so I think that some of that is that we need to do those and then make them meaningful. To me, one of the biggest things is to look to the Dutch example of having a independent anti-trafficking monitor who is not subjected to, who has the ability to get information and to make change within the government, but is not necessarily subjected to the desires of the particular government or the country's leadership. And we've seen, I think, such a strong tradition of that. It's not simply personality based, although there's been amazing rapporteurs in the Netherlands. To me, that is probably the most important. One of the things that we've saw because of the weakness of the protocol as far as any kind of monitoring mechanism is that the United States filled that vacuum with a unilateral monitoring mechanism that flowed out of the minimum standards in our trafficking law that we certainly tried to make sure were as closely aligned to Palermo as possible. But we see with the Council of Europe, I think, that having a regional monitoring mechanism on top of what countries can do themselves ends up being, I think, critically important. Places that don't have that, it all devolves back to whatever the Home Minister wants to have happen. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in the UK, where some very good things that were put into law then were put in place by folks who are using a security and an anti-immigrant posture. I think that might be what not to do as far as how to bring a human rights ethos into it.
Mike, may I pass on this the same question to you? What do you think? Which policies and national legislation, or what areas, should be or need to be reoriented in a way which is consistent with human rights standards? From your perspective.
Thank you, Helga. I'll quickly mention three things: capacity and prevention and protection. And two of them I can be quick on. Capacity, I don't mean whether we train frontline or specialist investigative police. I mean that there is a problem when national law enforcement officials are in charge of this anti-trafficking arena, because their whole training is inside their own country. We need people who understand migration, other cultures, links between states, and they tend to be excluded. I'm particularly concerned about that happening in my own country with a very nationalist sort of narrow focus. And so we end up calling things trafficking in the UK that are not trafficking. We end up with some law enforcement officials discriminating instead of protecting. As far as protection is concerned, I'm not going to add anything more. It needs strengthening substantially. On the ground, in some places that's happening. It needs to be through a legal framework, and often it is not, or not a proper framework. There have been lots of weaknesses in what's been done about prevention so far. We had a huge amount of so-called awareness raising, lots of posters, millions of dollars spent on posters, and then a lot of strengthening of capacity of institutions' own potential to respond to human trafficking cases. Both of those were needed on the starting block, but they're neither of them long-term prevention mechanisms. And what we need is a much broader approach to prevention, which puts the focus on a wide range of measures that would have the effect of preventing or reducing the levels of trafficking. They may not in themselves need to mention trafficking. So if I think about policies that prevent migrant workers from collective bargaining, or measures such as social protection, fixing minimum wages, particularly for migrant workers, imposing a ceiling on interest rates charged on loans, and so on. Yes, alongside that, the sex industry needs addressing as well, and more than just forced prostitution. So it's a very wide and substantial set of things. These should be in the human rights agenda. They were left out systematically from every anti-slavery convention in the 20th century. There's a lot to do. Some of it is in the ILO arena already, but not enough in the human rights arena.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maud, more or less the same question, but Baca mentioned, the institutional structures we established, and he was quite positive on that. But is it really so positive? Would they need more support, or is it just the minimum structures we have, and we don't provide them with the possibilities, to do what they should do, on prevention, on support, on understanding, on human rights approaches? What would you say? How do you see this situation?
Well, Helga, first of all, also it's a great pleasure to see you back after all these years. We've done a lot of things together, and this is an excellent opportunity to memorize our meetings, which took place in Strasbourg or in Vienna. Of course, as a former Council of Europe Deputy Secretary General, and as you said, being very instrumental in the coming about of this convention, I'm very strongly convinced that this regional context, and which is not just a geographical context, but also a context of an organization where human rights, the rule of law, and democracy are the basis on which every action of the Council of Europe is based, makes a difference. And that makes a difference because when the recommendations of Greta come to the table of the Committee of Ministers, which is the state parties meeting, the mere fact that this is all embedded in human rights is obviously very, very important. But perhaps more important, in addition, I think, is the context in which the fact that the European Court of Human Rights which is part of the Council of Europe, even if it's an independent judicial institution, but provides very clear guidelines or interpretation, which are extremely helpful for member states to understand their obligations. So I think this additional judicial institution being part of the whole mechanism of the Council of Europe reinforces even stronger the obligations which member states have committed to when they ratified the Council of Europe Convention. And I agree with Mike when he says that training, if it's if done by only local or national people, is not sufficient. It's important to exchange good practices, examples of where things can go wrong, and that's also why the Council of Europe provides this training. So again, training is absolutely crucial. It's also important to remember that in a lot of these identification issues, there are corruption issues. We haven't mentioned the word corruption so far, but I think that's something, again, where if there's a mechanism which is designed to fight corruption in that context, is also very helpful. Then in turn, when we talk about children, I think it's always very important to bear in mind that they have in one way or another a possibility to manifest themselves and to ask for help. And so hotlines, helplines, some kind of report, even phones with apps which are allow them to find, to show them where to go, what to do, being trafficked into a place which is with GPS, for instance. It's something which Missing Children Europe has developed, and I think it's extremely, a practical example of things which can be done to help these children, to tell them what their rights are, but also where they can have a shower. Little things like that. And so all this is part of a human rights environment, respect for the individual and in physical and moral integrity. And it's a concept which is in the Council of Europe so much present. And so that's probably why it works, even if many of the reports of Greta indicate shortcomings, but then countries do something about it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Isn't it sometimes a bit frustrating? We do so much, in these 20 years. So much training, so many manuals, so many conferences, so many whatever, but nevertheless, we have not come to the point really where we would say, oh, now we can make a difference. Isn't this somehow frustrating?
It is, and I can give you an example. I was in a country visit in an African country, the Gambia, and their police officers had been trained very extensively by international community, and really. But the problem is that there's a major turnover in the police. They change, and all the efforts are wasted. So there should be trace, and there should be handbooks, there should be guidelines. All these materials should be available, whether online or just physical handbooks. But it's very important, and I think the efforts made by the Office of the High Commissioner, and I think Mike, you were involved in the drafting of these guidelines also. I think they're very helpful, and I think one should look at them again, because they are a bit outdated, perhaps. The technique to recruit victims now is very much online, internet driven. So maybe even if the basics are the same, I think there may be some work to do there, and use that material also if we start thinking about a new convention or a new protocol. We haven't answered that question yet.
Christine, may I ask you, how do you see the role of the Security Council, in all of this? Do you think, Security Council as the word already says, you know, it's more on security than on human rights. But is there a possibility to involve them in a way that would make a difference in addressing human trafficking from a human rights perspective?
My short, cynical answer is that's a long, long way away. But to go back to where the Security Council has addressed at least some of these issues without talking about it as such, through the Women, Peace and Security agenda, they have made these various attempts at allowing for greater civil society participation within the Security Council, trying at least to bring different voices into them. Maria Grazia, we were at a area formula meeting earlier this year, where the Security Council was in fact attempting to do that. But you know, the reality is, as we know, I mean, look at the problems they're having at the moment of trying to get a resolution even on COVID-19. The politics aspect, and in particular, we have states on the Security Council, permanent members, who strongly resist the bringing of human rights into the mandate because they see that that is not part of international peace and security, and constant arguing that certain issues shouldn't be raised. But if we come back, try to link what you've just said with, I mean, the UK is a permanent member of the Security Council. The UK says that it is a champion of women, peace and security. It's the pen holder on the women, peace and security resolutions. That is a situation where it could clearly use its influence to, both within the Security Council, to try to link those two agendas more, but also looking domestically. We have a National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which they argue is strongly human rights oriented, but it's always about the human rights over there. It's externally looking. It's not looking internally at what is happening to women who come from women and men, boys, come from conflict affected areas into the UK, and there the women, peace and security agenda goes out of the window. It's the immigration agenda, it's the security agenda, it's the criminal enforcement agenda, all of those others. And I do think there's a big job to be done at home in trying to get the UK to recognize the need for this holistic view across, that you cannot separate out these different agendas in the way that they try to do so. I'm not sure that made too much sense.
I agree. So, I mean, we come to the point that we have to involve the decision makers, you know, and the politicians, really, you know, because all goes wrong if they don't want it. You know, we have a lot of examples, you know, recently anyway, also in the pandemic crisis, but also before, you know, they would just snip with the finger and then we don't do it, you know, and no matter how good the expertise is, no matter how many people are dedicated, you know, to make a change and to do it. Maria Grazia, may I involve you on one question would also be on if there are positive regional experiences and which experiences should be taken into consideration with a view to designing innovative legislation and policies. You know, it could mean further developing existing legislation. We come at the next step. Maybe we discuss whether we need a new international instrument, but we could also, you know, maybe amend, change legislation. Are there good regional examples?
Let me say a few words about what has been discussed, previously discussed, because this takes me to the point you raised. I think there are three areas in which national legislation and policies are really at odds with a human rights approach. The first area is the so-called identification model, which is conditional. Basically, it is about an exchange
cooperation against assistance, support, the package that has been designed for trafficked persons. And I have advocated in my last reports, first of all, I don't talk about identification any longer. I talk about early support to people, trafficked persons and persons vulnerable to trafficking, because I think that this model has been totally ineffective and it is absolutely nonsense from a human rights point of view. And more than this, I think that we should fight for disconnection, a complete disconnection of early support to vulnerable people and criminal proceedings, because the current identification model is also conditional to the fact that criminal proceedings has been initiated, that has been prolonged, in a few countries, even to the outcome of the criminal proceedings. In other words, if the perpetrator has been convicted. So we need to think strategically about how we can enlarge the area of people that are entitled to social protection measures, and what this new methodology could look like. But what it is sure is that the current identification model is completely at odds with a human rights approach. The second area is access to remedies. In fact, from this point of view, there is nothing at all, in the sense that, of course, criminal victims in criminal proceedings theoretically can get compensation if the perpetrators are convicted, which happens very, very rarely, and if something has been seized, if a patrimony has been found, in practice, nobody gets anything. And there has been no attention, there's no legislation, for example, enabling trafficked persons to complain before a civil court, which means a quick procedure, a free of charge procedure. It is unaffordable, for example, for the vast majority of people, the civil procedure to get compensation. Labor law procedure. In many countries, all this, even the theoretical possibility to access remedies, is conditional to the regular status of the person, which that doesn't happen. Yesterday, Parosha Chandran was recalling the fact that trafficked persons are systematically used to perform criminal or unlawful activities. This is not something that can happen eventually. This is a normal, a regular feature. So these people are, treated as criminals, are not entitled to access any kind of remedies. And the third area I would like to mention is that trafficking, Christine said before me, trafficking is not considered a gender-based violence. Even if the title mentioned, the title of the protocol, even the title of my mandate mentions women and children, this is embedded in a traditional substantialist notion of vulnerability, which is considered as pertaining to certain groups of people. Women so are weak because they are women. And the notion of imbalance of power producing gender discrimination and gender-based violence is not part of the culture of frontline officers, or even legislators dealing with trafficking, and not all the implications of this lack of recognition are, generally speaking, taken into consideration. For example, a narrative of a woman coming from a conflict situation or being exploited or sexually abused during the journey, the migration, or during a migration process, it is not even taken into consideration to qualify this person as a trafficked person. There are other considerations totally disconnected from this experience, this life experience, simply because there is no understanding about this. And what is the importance of, I can mention the Council of Europe Convention and as a region, as the best regional experience. Exactly for the reason Maud mentioned, because it is embedded in the mandate of the Council of Europe, which is a human rights mandate. And this makes the difference in the sense that, all the provisions of the Council of Europe Convention. Let me recall the fact that I was the scientific expert of the Secretariat of the Council of Europe when the convention was negotiated. Of course, completely changed the focus, the point of view. Something that has not been mentioned is that the identification, the conditional model, which is, of course, somehow linked with the law enforcement approach of the protocol, is not codified in the protocol, but is codified in the 2004 European Union Directive on residence permits for victims of trafficking and smuggling. There is the conditional model. And we tried during the Council of Europe negotiation very hard to overcome, to go beyond, to change this approach. And actually, the Council of Europe Convention is the only international instrument mentioning another way to get a residence status based on personal conditions. But this has been completely overlooked by national legislators. And of course, the result is that the anti-trafficking policies have been largely ineffective. And I continue to say that only a human rights approach can be really effective, because as long as we have this idea that trafficked persons should be identified as a matter of exception, in an exclusionary way, this exception becomes more and more modest, and it reduced to almost nothing. So
let me ask one thing, Maria Grazia. We had Italy years ago as an excellent example, because they had another way, for victims of trafficking, not the law enforcement way, but, with the former Article 18, where the social path, where it was possible to support victims without going through law enforcement activities, etc. But more or less, the country gave up. So do you have, how is it now? Gave up more or less, or
Article 18 is still there. Article 18 is my daddy, because I was head of the legislative office of the Minister for Equal Opportunities. So I had some part in this. It is still there because it is considered a benchmark, and no government had the courage to touch it. But it is not applied, or at least it is not applied in the social path. So, without saying, Italy is now aligned with the, current, mainstream of the identification methodology, with some exceptions. There are some law enforcement local authorities that continue to apply Article 18 correctly. But just to say that the mainstream goes in another direction. And this is the reason why I think we have to find ways to challenge this mainstream. Political will is not there. It's useless to look for political will at the government level. We need civil society. We need to find ways to challenge this mainstream, which is not, frankly speaking, satisfying.
Let me ask, how do you think, you all, how do you think we can challenge the political will? Can it be with a new instrument, with the negotiation? I mean, we know it will take years, probably.
No, I want to hear the others, the opinion of others.
So, do you think?
I will say my opinion.
Would you, Maria Grazia, or shall we start with Lou again,
With Lou again.
Okay, so Lou.
Okay.
The new instrument generate political will?
I'm skeptical. I think that on the one hand, a new instrument gives us something to pull against. It gives us a leverage point. And I think that it can create political will, as everybody then has to respond to it. But I think that what we're in a situation where I think two things need to be taken into account. First of all, a lot of the work that's been done in recent years by non-governmental actors, whether it's NGOs, whether it's frankly the business community, as we see the conversations around human trafficking moving away from some of the old debates of the 1990s and early 2000s, which were very much proxy wars around particular prostitution policies. I think that comes back, and it comes back with a vengeance if we were to try to negotiate a new instrument. And I don't think that that's necessarily helpful. I think that that would distract from the ongoing work out there to actually try to make good on what was settled upon in Vienna 20 years ago. I think that one of the issues there is that what we've seen is that it's taken many years through not only the regionals, but also through the United States unilateral reporting exercise each year to try to continue to push countries toward what is actually in the Palermo Protocol, as opposed to defaulting back over to the old security state approach of that goes all the way back to the League of Nations around migrant prostitution. And I think that if we were to reopen and to start to have everybody then align to a position, I think that one thing that we would see is scofflaw countries would use that to just dismantle their systems entirely. We saw that a little bit with the regional differences with SARC, for instance, under the leadership of the Indians for more than a decade. The SARC convention took South Asia into a very different direction and different trajectory than the rest of the world, because unlike everybody else who were aligning towards Palermo, the Indians were able to get SARC to double down on their commitment to the 1880s white slave trafficking regimen that the British Empire had brought around the world. And so a lot of what we had to do when I was in the Obama administration in South Asia was actually try to bring everyone away from that competing thing. We've seen that with some other things. Obviously, Russia and a number of the countries aligned with it over the last 15 years or so have tried very much to water down the UN response. I think we're also at a very different place than we were in 99 and 2000. The protocol predated the September 11th attacks, and more importantly, the massive securitization of the world and the Western world's governments under the counterterrorism ethos. And so it was a moment in which there might have been even a high water mark of government's willingness to entertain victim protections that we, as we look at it, are not as robust as they might have been. And I think so too, what we see is a different time and place vis-a-vis a number of the UN agencies. The International Labor Organization, the ILO, which was the keeper of many of the other instruments, the labor-based instruments, is now, I think, playing a constructive role on this fight, whether it's through Alliance 8.7 or whether it's through relationships that they've been able to carve out with their counterparts, whether at UNODC, IOM, etc. I think that if we open this up and really start to look at it again, we necessarily would be probably promulgating something that the ILO and all of their communities of interest would start to see as a direct challenge to the treaties and conventions that they care so much about.
The hidden agendas are nevertheless there, you know, so we have to be aware, you know, not discussing it in a broader sense, you know, nevertheless it's there, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that the politics of this and the push and pull and the fights, they are going to exist. Whether they should exist in the context of a negotiation for a new instrument, or whether they should be existing in the kind of the push and pull of implementing this one, I guess it kind of is, where do you want to have your fights? And at least with the existing instrument, we know what kind of the baseline parameters are that channel those fights and channel those, hopefully, innovations that maybe flow out of those fights.
Mike, I guess you have another, you see it in a different way. Please, Mike, you have the floor.
Yes, you can see my grey hair, so I'll take the long approach, start in 1815 and go from there. Well, we certainly have problems to solve in the human rights area. You know, over a century, we had about 10 instruments adopted dealing with different aspects of exploitation, some of them just on children. Most of them, apart from one, were prohibiting something, and they were not protecting human rights, they weren't preventing. In effect, even the ones we classify as human rights instruments were law enforcement ones. So that's a problem that needs solving. CEDAW might make a big difference as far as gender is concerned, but it won't be enough. I've looked at some of the regional human rights courts. I've looked at them to bring us up to date, and they have focused very satisfactorily in some cases on identifying the positive obligations of states when it comes to stopping slavery and servitude and forced labor and human trafficking. But they're scattered around. The one that I'm about to quote to you doesn't exist in English in a formal way. It's the Inter-American Court of Human Rights judgment on Brazil in 2016. And let me confirm, of course, that these regional human rights courts are not criminal courts that are commenting on a nasty trafficker. They're usually commenting on violations, well, they're always commenting on violations by states, but they're usually commenting on a failure of a state to act with due diligence. So the Inter-American Court in its 2016 judgment said that to act with due diligence, states must take comprehensive measures in cases of servitude, slavery, trafficking in persons, and forced labor. In particular, that they must have an adequate legal framework for protection. The prevention strategy must be comprehensive. That is, it must prevent risk factors and at the same time strengthen institutions so that they can provide an effective response to the phenomenon of contemporary slavery. In addition, states should take preventive measures in specific cases where it is clear that certain groups of persons may be victims of trafficking or slavery. Now, we can hope, we can read into the trafficking protocol some of these obligations, but this goes more broadly. It's looking back, in a sense, at a century of inadequacy that still needs to be addressed. Like Lou, I'm politically aware that we could make things much worse. I think even in the year 2000, the trafficking protocol was not, we didn't have the right atmosphere for making progress. I don't think we have it now, but we do need to move forward on these issues and find various tactics, and maybe one day it would be a human rights treaty. But in the meantime, we need to get the human rights machinery working much more coherently, not just the special rapporteurs on trafficking or sale of children or contemporary forms of slavery. We need much more of a systematic push on that message given by the Inter-American Court.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Maud, how would you react to this? You know, are you in favor, or rather you would say it's we can do a lot with what we have?
I would be in favor, but I don't think it's realistic. And so, I mean, what Louis said is very true. We risk that it backfires. The current human rights climate is simply not good enough to expect that governments will want to embark upon such an exercise in which human rights is top on the agenda is simply not very likely. I know that Migratio wants us to think independently of feasibility. I think our discussion tonight has shown that there are shortcomings and that there are other, like the Council of Europe, regional instruments which are better equipped to protect victims. Even that, those are minimum norms, so states can do better. And so again, I think that the existence at national level of institutions like national rapporteurs on trafficking would be really a great step forward. And that's something which the Council of Europe could recommend. But of course, this would be within a regional context. On the Council of Europe Convention, I just wanted to remind that this is an open convention, which is open to non-member states of the Council of Europe, which I don't think has materialized so far. We used to say this is made in Europe and not for Europe only. The question is whether there is confidence that there is really the situations which can occur in countries which are not in Europe, which are can be very different from many perspectives, are really willing to engage into also a monitoring mechanism, which would be based primarily on European composition. But this being said, I think that we are also missing an important opportunity, which is the SDGs. Which are in particular 8.7, where the relevance of ILO is obvious, and where, as far as children are concerned, much better use could be made of this ILO convention on the worst form of child labor, which includes sexual exploitation of children. This is an instrument which exists, but basically, I mean, is there anything happening which allows us to say that thanks to this convention, the situation is better or improving for children? I don't think so. And I think that if SDG 8.7 would be used also to create a more coherence between all the relevant instruments, because we have plenty of instruments which in one way or another affect the trafficking of children. That would be major progress. But what I've seen so far, I dedicated a report to that to the Human Rights Council 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years ago, I think. I really had to, I looked at the national reports because there is this voluntary reporting. The word children, you know, I had to use a loop to find it. Sorry, I'm always talking from the perspective of children's rights, but I think we all agree that this is a very important dimension also of the Council of Europe Convention. And I mean, it is really a model, and why can't we try to sell a similar model to other regions? We have ASEAN, we have the African context, we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, we have a commission. Why can't we try to see whether at that level there can be something like a convention which would be regional and take into consideration the realities on the ground in Africa. There's even an African Court of Justice and Human Rights. There is unfortunately a problem of resources, so we haven't seen much coming out of that court. But I'm basically very much in favor, given the situation which we know of, that we should develop and use the regional context, because that seems to work better in any event than a global one. And I mean, it would not be getting rid of the Palermo Protocol, but its implications and significance would be enhanced at regional level and also then at national level, hopefully.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And Christine, what is your opinion on this?
I share the skepticism of my colleagues on the panel. But to add another dimension of it, particularly, I think there's a parallel discussion going on as to whether there should be a global treaty on gender-based violence against women more generally. And I think, you know, as Maria Grazia said, and I said earlier myself, very clearly, the gender-based aspects of trafficking, if there is to be a new convention, that has to be included. And I think at the moment there is such a backlash. We saw it in the negotiation of the last WPS resolution, where even the inclusion of the word gender was hotly contested. In negotiating the Istanbul Convention, the issue of domestic violence as a form of gender-based violence was contested right the way through the negotiations. The inclusion, again, of sexual and reproductive rights, which would have to come into a treaty on trafficking, I think would be extraordinarily difficult at the moment. And I think that if there was any attempt to have a treaty on trafficking that excluded that whole gender dimension, that would be basically disastrous aspect. So that would worry me. But I think to pick up on Mike's point, I mean, there's an interesting dynamic going on at the moment, isn't there? There's this backlash against human rights, but there's some extraordinarily progressive, imaginative, innovative work coming out of the various human rights institutions. You cited the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I mean, another case which is not ostensibly about either slavery or trafficking, but is a gender-based violence case. In fact, the case against Venezuela, India Soto, where a woman was detained and held, etc. The language that the court used really linked it directly back to trafficking in a very imaginative, very innovative way. Maria Grazia has talked about reparations. We have the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court around the whole idea of transformative reparations, and the idea that reparations should not just be directed at the particular claimant in the particular case, but, like, you know, with respect to the community and the important part of non-repetition as part of reparation, and the obligation on the state to take steps to ensure non-repetition. Now, there's this enormous imaginative work coming on that, if we can hold that, if we can allow that to be developed through these various ways, if we get to the political climate, we can have a new treaty. I think we could have a really exciting one and really look at the way in which human rights itself has been a dynamic, living process over the last years. So skeptical and pessimistic at the moment, but I think there is enormous growing underlying ideas that we can build upon. And that maybe the answer is that we have to collect these now, be ready, grab the moment, when and if it actually arises.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before we close, we come to the question and answer section. I'd like to ask Maria Grazia, because we had discussions before, and I understood that you are also in favor somehow of a new instrument, maybe a new instrument which would cover more a broader issue, not just human trafficking, but let's say exploitation, a wider range of exploitation. Please, Maria Grazia, what is your opinion on that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, just to say that, of course, I'm aware that such an exercise is not possible today. But at the same time, I'm convinced that we should take a distance from realpolitik, because we need a vision. I'm absolutely sure of that. We need a vision. We need there must be a reason why what we are saying now, that there are promising approaches of human rights institutions, case law, other treaties, whatever we have said, is not part of the public discourse on trafficking. And I've been around during 20 years now, and I've tried. And so I've seen that civil society organizations are struggling every day with nonsense regulations, trying to navigate and find the creative solutions. So exactly because we are in a difficult situation, because human rights are at stake, I think we need a vision, and we should start to collect ideas for new approaches, for new ways to deal with issues, not to suggest that tomorrow the Human Rights Council will embark in a negotiation. No, because we need a movement, because we need ideas, we need people fighting for that. And I think that the idea of a new instrument, the idea of something which is, formalized somehow, can legitimate, can enhance ideas that are already, supported in the civil society organizations, in the academia, etc. For example, residence permit has always been considered something pertaining to discretion of state, with the added value of considering a residence status a right, a remedy under the notion of restitution or guarantee of non-repetition, which means if it is a right, there must be an appeal against a refusal decision. But to say all this, to formalize, to write down even such a concept, I think will give strength to people fighting for a genuinely human rights approach. And I think this is not another thing. This is not in opposition with what we have said about implementation. I think it is somehow the same movement we need to achieve results concerning implementation of the Palermo Protocol, national legislation, in combination with other human rights treaties, with the regional human rights courts, case law, etc. Because actually it is about trying to indicate a direction. I don't know if this is maybe naive. This is maybe naive, but I think that, frankly speaking, seeing what the world looks like at the moment, I think that we need to challenge, for example, the large, enormous toleration of exploitation, because what is slavery, forced labor, and trafficking after all? After all, is about exploitation of people, taking advantage unfairly of their labor and services. And we need to challenge all this because we are in this human rights difficult situation, and all the rights are at the moment challenged. So I think that yeah, maybe we have to be naive.
Yeah, maybe
and think that this is possible.
Yeah. No, I appreciate very much, yeah, but we probably also have to think how to somehow institutionalize such a discussion, you know, on visions, you know, because otherwise it remains, yeah, sometimes somebody has time, can do it or not. So I don't know, maybe we should discuss a little bit how we could initiate such a discussion, you know, going beyond the Palermo Protocol, for instance. Yeah?
I hope that an outcome of this webinar could be a group of experts, you know, somehow continuing the discussion, continuing the work, and ensuring that this is not limited to an afternoon, but can have some development and further, you know, sharing of thoughts.
Yeah, a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. Thank you very much. I mean, we just run out of time, but and it should now be my part to summarize the roundtable. I won't do that, you know, because this doesn't make sense. You know, it was excellent to listen not only to you but also to the panelists yesterday and also today. So it doesn't really make sense. And what Maria Grazia said is exactly, you know, where it should go. And finally, anyway, Maria Grazia will have once more the floor later on, and for the conclusions and for the to see where do we go from here, you know, where do we go, what do we want to do. But there should be short questions, so we will see if we have questions. And for the Q&A session, I don't even know where I can find it. I don't see anything here, but I hope it will pop up. It doesn't seem.
No question?
Yes, the questions are in the chat, Helga. We send them in the chat.
Sure.
Can you see the chat?
Okay. Oh yeah, yeah.
There are 5 questions that we sent.
So there is lost it again. Not here. The first question for this panel: how can the voices, and it's from Maria Roberta Serentino, how can the voices of victims and communities affected be used to design an instrument that empowers them, especially given that these processes are state-driven? So who wants it? It's more or less what we discussed. So how can we do that really? You know, we have this. Many things are state-driven. We would know, or some of us would know what to do, but the difficulty is how can we make it happen? Who wants to respond to this question? Maud, please.
Well, I can give an example of how the Council of Europe proceeds when it drafts convention. At some point in the drafting process, basically rather at a later stage, the text is sent, is put online, made available to civil society, and every single organization can make comments, and then that is being discussed by the drafting committee. So it's a participatory process in the Council of Europe, and I don't think that whatever the institution will be, if ever such a process would be initiated, that model can be easily followed. We have also the ECOSOC status at the UN, so I mean there are plenty of possibilities for civil society to get involved.
Mike?
There's a process at national level that we call evidence-informed policy making. It sounds like jargon, but basically it means that when you start a discussion about law or policy, you've already found out something. You've already talked to the people involved. You've already found out what are the problems that the law enforcement officials concerned encounter. What are the problems that the victims encounter. Now, in practice, in the trafficking domain, we found out vastly more since 2000 than we had before. Certainly, I don't think many people, bar Lou and a few others in Vienna, really knew the subject matter that they were making the protocol about. So it's not just in the course of finalizing an instrument, it's in the lead up and ensuring that something is not parachuted from above by a few ideologues who like this or like that, but rather is really reflecting human experience. And that human experience needs to come through monitors, through evaluations, as well as through active research. And again, there's been a huge amount of that in the last 20 years.
Thank you. Lou, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways the process starts with what we're doing right now. It starts with Maria Grazia's question and suggestion that we have to start visioning this, even if all of us are like, well, you know, let's not do it right now. We have to be thinking about what it should look like. And I spent a lot of time last night thinking about what my new car would look like if I get one. But I know I'm not going to do that until next year. I think it's the same thing. We need to have folks coming together. Maybe that's what comes out of this is the answer to what is the process. We are the process. And by we, I don't just mean the 6 of us on this part of the conference, but everyone who's watching and everybody who's been participating. We are definitely, to quote Barack Obama, we are the change we've been waiting for.
Christine?
Just to add that clearly, if we're having a consultative process of that sort, the importance of participation, inclusion by those who have experienced trafficking and by those who are working in the shelters, by those who are actively at that grassroots level, and to recognize their work, their voices, their input. They know an awful lot, about it all. And as Mike just said, to make sure it's not just a top-down process, but is a genuinely bottom-up as well.
Maria Grazia?
Well, I can offer 2 things. The first is my last report, the one I will present in 2 days to the Human Rights Council. And the recommendations in this report are conceived as an update of the recommended principles and guidelines, with a particular focus on labor exploitation, which was, of course, not at that time at the center of the reflection. So this is a document that can be used, that can be discussed, that can be also the basis for further thoughts. The second is that I have explored the possibility of giving continuity to this discussion also in another way. My concluding remarks could become sort of, I have circulated a draft these days, could be endorsed by a number of civil society organizations, of course, I agree. And this can also be used for advocacy. This is just starting point, just ideas, but we can start building something and use it in the dialogue, the daily dialogue with governments, with the reluctant governments to take into account a human rights approach. Yes.
Okay. I think we can take, as we skip my summary, really, because there will be the summary of the conference of the roundtable by Maria Grazia. We can take another question, which is perhaps more satisfying for those listening to us. So, and we have, there's a continuation of the previous question. Is it really the Security Council or UN who can make the difference? Or does it need to be a grassroots and large-scale movement? Surely involve decision makers and the duty bearers, but for a holistic approach, as Christine says, we need to ensure communities are not left behind and not just involved in awareness raising, but something more. Okay, who feels to respond to that? Mike.
I don't have to go first, but let me go back to top down and bottom up. We've seen in relation to the issue of modern slavery, which was added to the Sustainable Development Goals rather at the last minute, we've seen very much a top-down process of some wealthy philanthropists investing a lot. And it achieves interesting things, but it's the opposite of the old anti-slavery movement, which was mobilized in local communities. We've seen a lot of community action and effective action against all sorts of forms of exploitation at community level, and very rarely acknowledged as to play the important role that it does in protecting people. We've had to involve a different special rapporteur, the one involved in with human rights defenders in numerous cases where people reporting, for example, on a very exploitative company have been penalized even through the criminal law in some countries for their human rights activities. So we need to be doing much more to coordinate and to protect those voices, particularly when it's a question of resisting a stronger, much more powerful player, whether it's a strong company or, and now I'm thinking of a very, there are a number of superpowers around the world, but some of them are very negative towards civil society and don't allow the voice of local organizations that are defending migrant workers, for example, to really be heard outside their countries. We need to be doing much more to build on their experience, not just to take the, let's say, the assumptions of wealthy philanthropists as our starting point.
Who else wants to add on? Lou, please.
I think that one of the things that's really important is to think about, when we're talking about the communities and having community voices involved, who are those communities? So often I think that what we've seen, not just in the United States, but in the countries that I would look at around the world, is that idea that there would be a good-hearted person who is in a situation to do something. Maybe they're very much in a situation to do something because they're very rich, but it could be that they're from the dominant ethnicity, the dominant social class. It could be that they're middle class, but they choose to then do something on this, and they in many ways then carry out an anti-slavery or an anti-trafficking political and social movement that's based on their understanding of the thing that moved them to act. And so to me, the challenge is always, how do we credit the thing that moved them to act? How do we bring them in in that moment of goodness, but then also give them the 500 footnotes that they need to think about what their own assumption was in a way that doesn't drive them out or drive them back to the arms of only people who they already agree with. To me, the most important thing then ends up becoming having the survivor-led advocacy. And frankly, you cannot have survivor-led advocacy if you deport survivors. If you end up having a national referral mechanism that's broken, if you end up having conditionality, if you end up having no ways for somebody to 10 or 15 years later be a social worker, be a research chemist, be a business person, who then can be on something like what we had under President Obama and what the Trump administration, to their credit, continued as far as the president's survivor advocacy board. You have to then listen to them. I'm not as sure about whether their voices are being taken up by the White House as I could guarantee when I was in the Obama administration, but you'll never even get to the point where they can be listened to by the policymakers if you've got them on a 72-hour turnaround and you're sending them back to their home country from the beginning. So I think that's one of the things to me is, victim protection is not simply the right thing to do and a human right of that particular victim. Without victim protection, we will always end up having actors who are not the acted upon making decisions about those communities.
There is one more question, because I move on a little bit. Where does, interesting question, I think, where does the responsibility of states and assistance providers end in terms of supporting survivors to realize their rights? How do we measure success in terms of integration or reintegration? Can we realistically hold states responsible for such subjective and complex process of recovery for 5 or more years? I think it's quite interesting, because this is what states very often feel, so that they don't really feel responsible. So what can we ask them and to do? Who wants to respond to that? Do again, please.
I think one of the things is there's that tension in what can we ask, expect, or require on the one hand, and then what can we support, incentivize, and reward. One of the cases that got a lot of attention and led to many of the things that are in the Palermo Protocol, much less in the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act, is a sex trafficking case in Florida called United States versus Cadena. And in the Cadena case, what we see now 22 years later, is an FBI agent who basically made the decision not to seek other jobs in other parts of the country. He didn't go up to headquarters, which would have then got him promoted and all that stuff, because he realized that even as the women who were in that case had been reintegrated, had been able to even become US citizens under our trafficking laws, had jobs, had families, that there was always something that they were going to need from him. In other words, something they were going to need from the government. And he was afraid, and I'm worried now because he's getting to the point where he might be at mandatory retirement. He was afraid that if he left and tried to hand off just a file to someone, somebody who didn't know those women as anything other than names in a file, that they wouldn't have the support from the US government that they needed. What I worry about is, how do we take that personal commitment by government actors who are willing to, 20 years later, have that continuing relationship with a bunch of folks who are survivors, who don't need him every day, but every once in a while the wheels come off. They need help, with something with immigration for a relative. They need help because they're having flashbacks. They need help because it never really goes away. But also they just need to know that he's there. that to me is the hardest thing about integration, because I used to think that, 90 days or a year or 2 years, and then you could cycle people out. But what I've seen is with the people from my own cases is that we continue to see them needing help, but also, as you saw yesterday with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, you continue to see them leading all these years later. And so I think, unfortunately, the answer is the kind of when does the responsibility end? I'm starting to think that it doesn't.
Yeah. Somebody who wants to add to this? Mike, please. Yeah.
I think before we can say where responsibility ends, we can insist that it ends a lot further down the line than most governments that want to deal with a sort of bureaucratic approach, a checklist that says, right, we've done it, 30 days, finish. Imagine. And in a way, what we can see going back 150, 200 years is a systematic unwillingness of states, of governments to do what is necessary to restore the people fully in their rights. And I'm not going to point to any specific situations, but you see endless problems generations later caused by inadequate recovery support. I think we can still see that going on today. I've seen it in Southeast Asia in the last few years relating to a whole group of seafarers who've not been adequately assisted and so on. And of course, survivor groups all around the world will talk about that inadequacy. So I think it's premature to talk about the end. What we're really saying is that much is grossly inadequate. It's got to be longer, more substantial.
Yeah, I think Maud, you want to add something, or Christine?
Yeah, no, sorry, just one word. Yeah, for children, I think apart from the immediate support and whatever we have already mentioned, I think there should be a life plan discussed with them. That obviously has a long-term implications, but it should be a realistic discussion about what this child can become in the course of its future life. And so that is a long-term engagement for which the authorities are responsible under the due diligence principle.
Christine, do you want to add something?
No, fine.
Please.
No, so at this point, no, thank you.
Yeah, so we have come, I mean, there are a few more questions, difficult to answer. I can read you one more, but we come to an end now. The other question was what to do when governments have other priorities, such as fighting organized crime, or drugs, or fighting corruption, issues that are obviously important, but that leave human trafficking in a second or third term. Well, difficult to answer, because this is what is for most of the time the case, frankly speaking. This is what we more or less every day. So if somebody wants to answer to that, I'll give a quick answer. If not, Maria, grazie.
Yeah. Of course, the fight against organized crime and the fight against corruption is not necessarily in opposition with a good policy on trafficking. On the contrary, of course, to affirm the rule of law is essential in the fight against trafficking and the protection of human rights of victims. People are vulnerable globally exactly because they are deprived of the protection of the rule of law. The vast majority of people globally are outside the rule of law. So this is particularly important, and this is actually one of the merits of the Palermo Protocol, to have reaffirmed in this field the rule of law, and corruption. Again, it is essential also because corruption is always implied, always involved in trafficking scheme. If we hear the narratives of the interviews with the trafficked persons, we find out that during the journey there is always a corrupt official. The problem is not there. The problem is that the declarations, and we hear every day declarations about this heinous crime, etc., are absolutely overwhelmed, not by the priority of fighting against organized crime, not by the priority to fight against corruption, but the priority to push back migrants. Mm-hmm. This is really at odds with a good anti-trafficking policy, because, of course, again, we go back to the model of identification as an exception vis-a-vis the treatment of migrants, and it is not part, unfortunately, of the trafficking, the public discourse on trafficking. Talking about the authorities, of course, not the civil society. The idea that trafficked persons' rights can be protected only if migrants' rights are protected, only if workers' rights are protected. Because, of course, such policies exacerbate or even create vulnerabilities, even if vulnerability was not there at the very beginning. There are people that have been trafficked after years of residence in a destination country, even regular residence, and simply because for social and economic reasons they become vulnerable and were not, they were not socially protected, included in systems of in a system of social protection. So this is, in my view, the real problem. The real problem is to challenge this xenophobic and even racist approaches that, unfortunately, different kind of populisms have strongly, imposed in the public political sphere. So I see the prevention and fight against trafficking also as part of the fight for a new approach to migration, which is of course a significant contribution is the UN Compact, the Global Compact. But again, I think that we have to consider migration as a human rights field, which is not the case, because this is still considered, even by international law, I have to say, as a matter of national sovereignty. And of course, when I see that we need a vision, and again, it's not for today, but what the mayor of Palermo said yesterday, that the international mobility should be considered a human right, has to be considered as an element of a different vision. I don't know if I have answered the question.
So thank you very much. We could continue, I think, with this panel, but I have to close it. So I would really like, it was really a great panel. I think also those who listened to you and asked the question, it was a summary of all the questions we had. This was quite for them quite interesting and really to the point. So thank you very much to the panelists, to Maud, to Mike, to Christine, to Lou, and to Maria Grazia, of course. And we shall continue, or the conference will continue with Maria Grazia with her closing remarks. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you, Helga.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being with us and for this fantastic panel. I think it is really the first time that I hear such a open, frank, and very interesting conversation about this important and difficult issues. So we are running late. My concluding remarks will only be a 12-point final recommendation, which should be considered a sort of living document. I have circulated a draft among a number of civil society organizations, and of course the speakers and the moderators before the webinar. But there will be, of course, updated, taking into account the discussion and taking also into account whatever you will convey to us as comments, suggestions for additions, etc. They will be put on the website of interested organizations. I think on the road, maybe also La Strada. We will tell you more about the following steps. So of course, in this draft I circulated, there is a sort of analysis of the situation, but I don't repeat this because I think from this point of view we agree about recognizing the merits of the Palermo Protocol, recognizing the main inconsistencies existing in the text of the protocol, inconsistent with a human rights approach, but also in national legislation, which is not always fully complying with the protocol. Of course, there is also a call for interpretation and implementation of the protocol in combination with the other human rights instruments, both binding and soft law instruments, and the case law of regional human rights courts. We know that there is a recent move to anti-slavery legislation calling for action from the business community, and of course we have to acknowledge that this has been a powerful advocacy tool, although in the vast majority of this legislation there are not many really. We can mention California, UK, Australia, and now the recent Canada and the recent French law. But at the beginning, the reporting obligations were really minimal, and only the French law actually includes, concrete actions such as the adoption of a plan of vigilance to minimize risks, and the obligation to all the companies responsible if they don't comply with such obligations. This is a recent move and a very promising one. We will see what the implementation will suggest. I think, and I suggest, 20 years after the adoption of the protocol, to try to go beyond the protocol in terms of implementation in 3 directions. First of all, act to reorient the implementation of the Palermo Protocol and related national legislation through an integrated interpretation of binding human rights binding and soft law instruments adopted since 2000. Advocate for deep changes in national anti-trafficking legislation and policies that should be brought into compliance with human rights standards. And third, consider the possibility of adopting a new international instrument addressing exploitation from a human rights-based approach. And for this purpose, I would like to offer a 12-point final recommendation. I read because we are running late and it's easier to read and shorter to read. First, the human rights of trafficked persons shall be at the center of all efforts to prevent and combat trafficking and to protect, assist, and provide redress to victims. Second, states should demonstrate their political will and commitment in concrete and effective ways to prevent and combat exploitation in all its forms. Civil society organizations and survivors' advice should always be taken into consideration when designing and implementing policies aimed at preventing and combating trafficking, slavery, forced labor, and exploitation. States should consider prevention to be a political priority, including by taking concrete actions to address root causes, including extreme poverty, gender discrimination, domestic and sexual violence, destitution in situations of conflicts, natural disasters and pandemics, as well as systemic injustice. Effective action should be undertaken regarding education about respectful relationships, including from a gender perspective, and actions aimed at eradicating racism and xenophobia and discrimination on any grounds, including gender, age, race, or national origin, social and/or residence status, and creating a social and cultural environment that does not condone any kind of exploitation. Fourth, states should make profound changes to their migration policies, including by establishing significant channels for regular migration to allow people to come and work, abolishing any form of sponsorship that ties workers to a single employer, banning administrative detention for children, establishing a firewall between the access to social services and migration checks, and fully complying with the principle of non-refoulement, also through conducting accurate risk assessment before any decision on return. Such policies should always include a gender and child-sensitive perspective. Fifth, states should establish an innovative methodology to provide early support based on confidential interviews with people at risk, including migrants in places of first arrival, managed by trained staff aimed at identifying not elements of crime, but rather personal and social vulnerabilities to trafficking and exploitation, based on an individual assessment and taking into consideration complex gender-based and intersectional discrimination and marginalization factors. The decision about granting early support and residence status, if needed, should be made by interdisciplinary teams established by civil competent authorities. Moreover, states should ensure full integration between asylum procedures and referrals of trafficked and exploited persons to appropriate and specialized services. Civil society organizations should be funded to provide early support to exploited persons, including migrants, irrespective of their residence status or formal vulnerability determination. Sixth, states should establish legislation on recruitment agencies and brokers, carry out regular checks, criminalize recruitment and gangmaster activities associated with severe exploitation, ask companies to use only well-regulated labor recruitment firms, and to fully cover recruitment costs. Seventh, states should strengthen legislation on labor rights and enhance labor inspections. Moreover, states should ensure that companies that get government contracts and benefit from government procurement are able to demonstrate genuine results on labor issues, including in their supply chains, such as obtaining evidence that their subcontractors and service providers pay fair wages and recruitment costs. 8. States should establish legislation on social compliance, requiring companies to disclose not only action undertaken to prevent and eradicate exploitation from their supply chains, but also concrete and verifiable results achieved. Companies should be obliged by law to identify risks and adopt plans to minimize them, and should be held liable for damages if they have not complied with such requirements. Businesses have a due diligence obligation to comply with human rights standards. Companies, especially mother companies with large supply chains, should change their business model and integrate the protection of labor standards into their ordinary business plans, including in their relationships with their suppliers and service providers. For this purpose, companies should establish monitoring mechanisms, plans to address risks, and grievance mechanisms to enable workers to report exploitation, to solve disputes, to obtain unpaid or underpaid wages and compensation through speedy procedures. States should introduce in their legislation a non-punishment provision to ensure that victims of trafficking, slavery, and forced labor are not charged, detained, or prosecuted for illicit activities in which they have been involved as a direct consequence of their situation of victims. Furthermore, states should decriminalize the selling of sexual services and all related behaviors not amounting to exploitation as defined by the Palermo Protocol, an irregular entry or irregular stay where such behaviors currently constitute a crime. 11th, states must ensure that trafficked and exploited persons can appeal decisions of competent authorities regarding denial of early support and residence permits and facilitate their access to justice and remedies. According to the principle of due diligence, states must ensure that trafficked persons are entitled to claim the full spectrum of remedies for gross human rights violations, including restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantee of non-repetition. Access to remedies should be ensured to all exploited persons, be it through criminal, civil, administrative, or labor law proceedings, irrespective of their presence or legal status in the country, including by providing for free legal counseling and representation, speeding up related procedures, and establishing public funds for compensation. An individual independent guardian must be promptly appointed in the best interest of the child when she or he is unaccompanied or separated from the family. Victims must be protected from secondary victimization. Their rights, such as the right to privacy, must be respected at all times during judicial proceedings. 12th, states should ensure funding for victim support, not limited to short-term assistance, but including long-term sustainable measures aimed at promoting full social inclusion of trafficked and exploited persons. Such measures should be of a transformative nature, based on education, training, skill acquisition, and help to seek employment or establish a business, not based on traditional gender roles, taking into account interests and aspirations of the person concerned, and designed in the best interest of children. This is my 12-point final recommendation. I would like to recall that another webinar for Africa and Asia will be held on the 13th and 14th of July, more or less with the same structure. And this will be also a way to consider this a living document, to update it, and to convey, to bring together all the civil society organizations willing to endorse it. Thank you very much. Thank you to On the Road and for their precious cooperation in designing the seminar and make possible that this seminar takes place. Thanks to the city of Palermo, to the mayor of Palermo, to all the participants for their patience to be with us until very late, and to the speakers and moderators. These 2 days have been really a fantastic hub of thoughts, ideas, new approaches, and I think that we will really have an opportunity to ensure continuity to this work through a group of experts. Thanks a lot.